Just start.
And Marquise, we can just talk to you and say, hey, next slide. And I think
Yeah.
if this slide could come up during Gia's introduction, that would be great.
Okay. All right, let's start it. Still see the slides, right?
Ryder, yeah, we see the slide.
Okay.
But you're on. I can't hear you.
Can't hear me?
Can you hear me? I just haven't said anything.
Yep.
Okay.
Oh.
I'm about to start. I think we're okay. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We are so glad you're here. Before we get started, we want to note just a few housekeeping points. To avoid background noise, all participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We will be addressing questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions as the webinar continues, please enter them into the questions box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen if viewing from a computer, or at the bottom of your screen if viewing from a phone. If you have any comments or concerns during the webinar, please also enter these into the questions box. We will review and address any immediate needs as they occur. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to each registrant tomorrow. The recording will also be available on our website at www.namimd.org for any individuals that were unable to register. After the webinar today, you will be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved, and what you would like to see in future webinars. We plan to continue hosting educational webinars, and we ask that you please fill out this survey to let us know how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. I'll now hand it over to our moderator.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Gia Greer-McGinnis, a board member with NAMI Maryland, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. We are pleased you've joined us today for this very important topic. Today, we are hosting Tim and Ryder Davis. Tim and Ryder will share their mental health journeys and provide extensive examples of how to prioritize and improve your own mental health and help others when they need it. NAMI Maryland supports you in the hard work you do, and we want you to benefit from your time with us this afternoon. Please note that CEUs are not provided for today's webinar, but a certificate of attendance will be sent to each registered participant tomorrow afternoon. And now I'll welcome today's speakers. After learning of Ryder's diagnosis with bipolar disorder, Tim Davis found support, hope, and inspiration through the free classes and support groups offered by NAMI. Before long, he joined the NAMI Westside affiliate and spent 4 years supervising programs and services as their senior program director. In that role, he spurred exponential growth for the organization, particularly spearheading the expansion of their Ending the Silence program. Tim has extensive experience as a public speaker, having given over 300 presentations to students, families, and community leaders, sharing his passion for open, honest, and destigmatizing conversations, and his lived experience as the father of a young man who lives with a mental health condition. Tim currently serves as the Communications and Operations Director of Hollywood Forward, where he brings a diverse, multidisciplinary background and a long-term commitment to the health and welfare of vulnerable populations to an organization dedicated to preventing and ending street homelessness in Hollywood. Our next presenter is Ryder Davis. Ryder Davis is a 23-year-old mental health presenter from Santa Monica, California. His life changed forever with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder at the age of 18. While recovering from manic episodes and piecing his life back together, he dealt with not only internal trauma, but a lot of external stigma. He found that the best way to process these struggles and to combat stigma was to share his experiences with students and parents as a part of NAMI's Ending the Silence program. He is proud to have given over 100 presentations, both online and in person, over the last 4 years. Ryder studied journalism at Boston University and is now back in Los Angeles working in a variety of roles for NAMI and continues to give presentations with his father, Tim. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tim and Ryder. I'll turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Gia. Thank you, Marquise. We are so happy to be here this morning. I hope everyone can hear me. Marquise, Gia, I will assume you'll give us a heads up if you can't. And actually, we can, Marquise, you can move to the next slide now, too, which gives you a little little glimpse of our lives. We do both live and work in Los Angeles, but we are currently in Maine on a vacation. We're staying with my dad in his very old house in Maine. And he has been instructed to stay out of the area where we're presenting, but we might have a third generation join us from time to time if there's a, you know, if somehow my boundaries are not respected. And by the way, we will be talking about boundaries and respecting boundaries later on. But I do want to say it is incredible pleasure to be talking to a NAMI audience again. This is actually my first time. Ryder has continued giving presentations since I left NAMI in April of 2022, but this is my first time talking to a NAMI audience again, and it's an amazing pleasure and an honor. Spoiler alert, which you've already heard from Gia's lovely introduction, NAMI was a big part of our recovery, and we'll be sharing how important that was to us a little bit later in the presentation. But I also want to say, before I turn it over to my co-presenter, I also want to say that, like, one of the most heartbreaking things that I remember from giving these presentations to students in particular is when a student in the back of the room would raise their hands, and, you know, they've just heard us talk about the importance of learning to share honestly and vulnerably what we're going through. And I can't tell you how many times we heard students raise their hands and say, well, what if we can't? What if I don't feel safe? What if I don't feel like I have someone who's capable of listening to me and hearing me discuss my troubles? And that's one of the things that fuels my desire to continue giving these talks, to just try to make it easier for, and by the way, I was one of those parents too, who was not really available to connect and hear what Ryder was going through, or his sister too. I want to make a little shout out to his sister and to siblings everywhere and to loved ones everywhere who also have to learn to cope with a mental health condition in their midst. And anyway, thanks for I know I've gone on too long, and Ryder's probably already a little upset with me, but I'm gonna now, I'll turn it over to him, and really glad to be here. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much to NAMI Maryland, to Kate and Marquise. We've been very excited for this all summer, or since we got this opportunity. And so presenting, and mostly on behalf of NAMI, has been a huge part of my life the last 5 years. But 5 years ago, I never thought I would be having any sort of platform or talking to any group of people about mental health. But here I am. And as Gia said in her generous introduction, I have lived with bipolar disorder for the last 5 years, since I was a senior in high school. And talking about my mental health is not always easy for me, but I always feel better when I talk openly about it. So my dad and I have 3 big goals for this talk today. And the first is to share our experiences turning our trauma into triumph, the ongoing journey, and also the ongoing journey of learning to communicate better with each other, to communicate more effectively. And this is a way of saying, if we can do it, so can you. Our second goal is to make clear how important it is that we all learn to prioritize our own mental health, and to leave you guys feeling empowered to do so. And our third goal is to show you how to support a friend or family member who is struggling with a mental health condition or signs of a mental health condition. And that starts with communication.
Thanks, Bud. And I'm just struck as we start to lean into this, you know, yeah, Ryder's given this talk 100 times, and he could have given it 1,000 times. It still is an amazing achievement that I want to just mark right from the start, that he's able to show up on his vacation and to have this kind of a conversation, which, like he said, it's not easy. And even in the preparation for this, we are confronting some difficult, challenging areas for us, but we've learned how to do that now. And so that's, again, what we hope will be communicating today, and make it easier for you all to do the same. Just really, and again, it's not also, you know, I do this a lot, but it's not always easy for me. And I'm just really, again, it's amazing to be able to do this in partnership with my son. We have a couple disclaimers. We are going to be talking about, you know, trauma, mental health conditions, a lot of difficult, challenging topics. And we want to make sure that you all take care of yourselves. We occasionally may say something that hits a little close to the bone. And again, we want to walk the walk here, and we want to encourage you to do the same, to take care of yourselves. And if that means turning off your camera, or turning off the presentation, maybe coming back to it and listening to it later on the recording, that's totally fine. I think we do have a lot of value to communicate here, so I hope you'll get to it at some point, but we want you to take care of yourselves. And the other thing I need to say, and I learned this giving the NAMI presentations, is we are not doctors or counselors or therapists. We're not those kinds of experts, but we are experts in our own lived experience. So with mental health conditions, which means when we talk about topics like trauma, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD, and how important it is to learn how to ask for help when you're encountering these kinds of struggles, we're talking as two people who haven't just learned these lessons, we have lived them. And the other thing I want to point out is the title of the presentation is Turning Trauma into Triumph. So, but when we say triumph, or when we talk about being mentally healthy, that doesn't mean living in a state of bliss and happiness all the time, but it does mean being able to handle the difficult times in life without causing ourselves or our friends or our loved ones even greater distress. And Marquise, you can go to the next slide now. And as these stats show now on this slide, a lot of young people are experiencing distress around mental health these days, particularly in the wake of the pandemic.
So yeah, these stats show how common this is. So 1 in 5 young people in the US are experiencing right now a mental health condition or will. It's a pretty staggering rate. And of those who do experience a mental health condition, close to half won't ask for help. One reason for that is stigma, which we're going to touch on in depth later in this presentation. But another reason people don't seek help is the lack of awareness around what mental health conditions look like. What they don't know, and what we didn't know 5 years ago when I first began experiencing a mental health condition. So growing up, mental health was not something that I thought about. I didn't think it was important. I didn't think it really mattered at all. I knew there were mental health conditions, or as I definitely thought of them then, mental illnesses like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder. And I thought people with those conditions were not functioning members of society, were useless, were, essentially leading meaningless, painful lives. And that's really all the thought I gave to mental health and mental health conditions until it was me. So my second semester of my senior year, I was only a couple months from graduating. I began experiencing some drastic changes in my mood, in my behavior, and in my thoughts. Marquise, I think the next slide is just a black screen or something. Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, so I was experiencing these real changes, noticeable changes very quickly. And I was beginning to scare my friends, worry my parents, or worry my family. And they didn't know what it was, my friends or my family. And it kept getting worse. And I was speaking really fast to the point where people couldn't understand what I was saying. I was spending money extremely recklessly. And I was basically just uninhibited in every aspect of daily life, behaving really recklessly and strangely, I'm sure, to those around me. But in my head, I was having the time of my life. I thought I'd never been happier. I'd never been cooler. I'd never been more charismatic, more charming. Of course, none of those were true. But in my head, they definitely were. So these symptoms worsened and worsened day by day, as I've said. And after about a week of this, it got so bad that 2 of my friends went to my school counselor and said, Ryder needs help and we don't know how to help him. And to this day, I am eternally grateful for those friends. And I was lucky enough to have developed a pretty close relationship with this counselor over the years, going to the same school. And so I felt comfortable going to him and talking to him, even though I myself did not think there was anything wrong. But within a few minutes of sitting down with him, he told me that I was having something called a manic episode. But again, I had no awareness. I had no idea what that meant. He could have been speaking another language. But he explained, and suddenly my parents came to school, they picked me up, and they took me to a psychiatric hospital. Sorry. And it was there that I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So all those preconceived notions, all those negative connotations that I had about mental health conditions like bipolar, suddenly I applied them to myself. And before I could dwell on that too long, I was taken to a psychiatric, ward or a mental hospital all the way across town. And it was a pretty harrowing experience. I won't lie. I'm very grateful and was lucky enough to have a pretty sheltered, privileged childhood. And suddenly here I was. I had just turned 18, so I was put in with adults. I was put in with people a lot older than me, 40s, 50s, 60s, most of whom were on and off the streets. And of course, there was a common denominator among us all, which was mental health conditions, mental illness. And I was in that hospital for 3 days, but it sort of felt like 30 years. And once I got out, I came home and I knew my life would never be the same. And in that moment, I thought my life would never amount to anything. And I didn't know if I would ever be the same.
Well, thanks, buddy. Marquise, thank you for getting to the trauma slide. This is actually when we hoped the slide would come up, because we wanted to sort of highlight the fact that what Ryder was just talking about was a really serious trauma that he experienced. And it was actually sort of two traumas. It was this episode, a psychotic episode that he had experienced, and then being sent to a psych ward. And I don't want to frighten anybody about psych wards, but it was a really frightening experience for Ryder at 18 to receive this diagnosis, to be placed on what's called a 5150, which is a 3-day psychiatric hold. And I remember watching him getting handcuffed to a gurney in the ER and being wheeled out of the ER, taken to the psych ward for 3 days. And it was the most hopeless, helpless experience I've ever felt in my life. And, Ryder maybe doesn't like to always hear this, but it was trauma for me and for his mom too. And I'm sure many in our audience can relate to that. When you see a loved one suffering like that, especially a child, there's just nothing worse. And we had no idea. We had no idea what we were dealing with. I mean, Ryder, he was describing his symptoms. We didn't know, he had this very elevated mood. He was talking fast. He wasn't sleeping. He was picking fights with everyone, but especially his mom and me. And we thought he was doing drugs. We thought he had somehow developed some kind of a cocaine addiction, because we didn't know better. And again, I'll share more about that when we get to shame and stigma. But for now, we're all, as a family, including his sister, dealing with this, what felt like a bomb going off in our lives. And so, what it also brought up for me, and what I realize now in hindsight, but didn't at the time, is it was bringing up my own trauma. And I want to share briefly, before we get to shame and stigma, I want to share briefly about the trauma that I experienced as a child. I grew up in New York City, had mom and dad, have a little brother, Nick, who is also here in Maine with his family members. And so that's partly a little bit of a triumph over this particular trauma I'm going to share. But when I was 11 years old, I was walking in New York City with my mom, and two taxis hit each other, speeding through stop signs, and one spun around and hit my mom and killed her. And yeah, that's an example of a stark example of a very serious trauma. And I'll be, when we give these presentations to students, especially younger students, I'll be a little careful about the way I share about this, but I think it's important. And I've learned how important it is to deal with my own stuff, because if I'm not dealing with my own trauma and I'm just responding to Ryder's difficulties or other loved ones' difficulties through a lens of my own untreated trauma, I'm no good to anybody. I'm no good to myself, and I can't really show up for Ryder. So learning to talk about my trauma has, frankly, it's made me a better dad. Probably made me a better presenter. But I'll end with it made me a better loved one, able to support to support Ryder and to support his sister as they cope with this difficulty that hit our family. So now, actually, Marquise, you can now go to the shame and stigma slide. And I think I already mentioned, one way, stigma is, and I do like to share this when I'm talking to students, but it's a good thing, I think, for all people to know. This stigma, the word stigma comes from the term stigmata, which was the term for the dark holes that were left in Jesus's palms when he came down off the cross. Whether you believe or not, but that's where the term came from, stigmata, and that's what stigma feels like. It feels like a big black mark on your life. And as a white guy growing up in America, I haven't dealt with a lot of forms of stigma that I know many other people have faced, but I have dealt with mental health stigma, and I've dealt with my own shame and stigma around my own trauma. I also developed, a pretty bad drug and alcohol addiction as a teenager. And I wouldn't say it's as a response. I think that alcoholism and addiction runs in our family. So I think I might have been in line to experience it anyway, but it certainly was a way of coping with my trauma and with all the terrible, feelings I had, with which I wasn't able to process. And that all came up, that helplessness, that hopelessness. Oh, I felt like I couldn't save my mom. Well, here I am with my son now, and I feel like I can't save him because I'm still operating from that untreated trauma. And so by being able to look at this, clear-eyed and talk about it honestly and openly, feel my shoulders, starting to relax. And I remember also, his sister, who I've mentioned, his younger sister, she has had a serious nut allergy her whole life. And we've had to take her to the ER a number of times when she eats nuts, but there's no stigma around a nut allergy. So I was always able to talk about it easily and, tell friends about it and talk about, getting help for her. She gets an EpiPen. She's learned how to treat her nut allergy. When my son was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I couldn't talk about it. I felt I was bathing in shame, and I would whisper to people, yeah, my son has bipolar disorder. And I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to do. I mean, and yeah, you're whispering because you feel so awful and hopeless and, again, just crushed by shame. So really, starting to look more clearly at that was a way of starting to move through the shame. And learning also and giving the NAMI presentations was really helpful, and giving presentations with young presenters like Ryder, who were sharing honestly about living with mental health conditions. I kind of came to learn mental health conditions are not a death sentence. They don't have to stop you from living awesome lives. And when you hear more from Ryder, you're gonna see he's a great example of that. Also, now I'm sliding a little bit into the next slide about how we got help, but learning about the language, the thing about Ryder is, like, there was the trauma of the diagnosis, the being in a psych ward. Then all of a sudden he's dealing with these labels: bipolar disorder, mental illness. And that was also crushing. And again, I couldn't talk about it. I would whisper about it. And again, going to NAMI support groups where we would see people who had adult children who've been living for years with mental health conditions, and people are making jokes and they're carrying their burden like kind of lightly. It made me realize, like, I have to get there. I want to get there, but how? How do I get there? And, learning about warning signs, learning how to recognize when Ryder might be sort of veering towards mania. And he'll be sharing shortly about, like, he had 2 further bouts of mania. And again, they came in quick succession. We didn't know how to handle them, but we were slowly but surely starting to get a handle on what it looked like, so that we could talk to him and say, hey, this looks like you could be heading towards mania. I'm not saying that was the right way to do it, but at least we were starting to get a grasp of these warning signs. Now, for Ryder, he was continuing to deal with internal stigma, self-stigma, and that it can be crippling. And I know that from my own experience, but I really love hearing how Ryder shares about his own.
Yeah, as I was saying before, when I applied those preconceived notions about mental health conditions and bipolar to myself, that's called self-stigma. And so getting out of the hospital, that continued to increase and increase, because I had, I was a teenager. I'd already had a lot to be anxious and, trouble with self-esteem, things like that. But overall, I was a pretty confident guy. Suddenly that was all gone. All 100 to 0. And I felt like I had been completely humbled by something out of my control. And not only that, it wasn't temporary. This felt like a life sentence. This is not curable. It felt to me then, was not treatable. I was completely wrong about that. But another big piece of this is that I suddenly felt like I was different than anyone else. And no matter what age you are, but as a teenager or a young person, I think most really don't want to feel that way. And I know I didn't want to feel that way. But suddenly I had a concrete label. I had this big, big term I felt almost tattooed on my face: bipolar, different. So those first couple of weeks out of getting out of the psych ward, I basically just sat in my room in the dark, trying not to think about how my life was over. And definitely not a good time for me or anyone around me. And those are sort of the 2 poles of bipolar: mania and depression. And so that come down from mania was hard. And suddenly, where I had felt on top of the world, I felt like there was no world, or the world does not have a place for me in it. So this period was not too long, because my parents and I found this outpatient treatment center very close to my house, where I could go during the day, sort of like school, and go to different forms of group therapy with other kids or teens around my age who were dealing with similar things. And week by week, this really proved to help. And the biggest thing was just to be around people who made me feel like I wasn't so different after all. And some of the groups really took a hold on me as well: art therapy, music therapy, a lot of meditation, things like that. And I'll get to, I'll get to more of that in our help section. But after a couple months of this, in about maybe a month to go before I graduated high school, I was really determined and excited to get back to school, to see all my friends. And this determination, this excitement, turned to mania once again. And this episode was actually harder for myself and for others, my parents, my friends, because I knew what it was, and they sort of knew what it was, and yet we didn't really know how to stop it. And it was during this episode that I wrote and performed an original song to my entire school. And, this is not criminal. This is not super harmful behavior, but it serves as an example of something that I would not have done before. And it's something that I certainly have not done since. And
it was a great song, though. Let's just stop for a moment and reflect on that.
Thanks for adding.
Sorry, I'll shut up.
And you know what's hilarious? A little inside our presentation here, he's done that 20 times when I talk about the song. He unmutes himself and he says, "It was a good song." Well, anyways, enough about the song. Yeah, it was. I was really spiraling again, and this time I didn't go to the hospital, but after that mania had sort of crested, I hit an even lower low, and I was put on more medication, and I was put on so much medication to the point that I was essentially asleep for my own high school graduation, which I've been looking forward to for so very long. Dad, if you could please mute, thank you. I heard just a loud breath. And after this, I was so low, it almost didn't feel like I was depressed. I was sort of an empty vessel with no feelings to feel at all. And my dad even tried to get me out of it by bringing me to a couple Grateful Dead shows. And it kind of worked, but not really. Anyways, this summer goes on and I remained in treatment and I felt like I was getting better. And I'd arranged to take a gap year between high school and college so that I could, continue to recover and get better to the point where I could go to college. So summer ends, the fall starts, and pretty much all my friends are leaving for college. And I got out of my treatment center and I found a job that I was really looking forward to as working at a pool at a nice hotel near our house. And I was really excited for this job. Maybe you can see where this is going. And that excitement led to a third manic episode. And this one landed me in another psychiatric hospital, which, yeah, also not fun and not like a walk in the park, if you will. And it was at this time I really feel was my rock bottom. In the span of 7 months, I had 3 manic episodes. And it's really important for me to stress how harmful these manic episodes are to my brain chemistry, to my relationships with family and friends, to my bank account, least importantly, maybe, but very much a factor still. Each manic episode was like a wrecking ball to my life, and now 3 had swung in such a short span of time. And now I was back in the hospital, a different hospital, but I was back in the psychiatric hospital again. And so I really felt like I was at a crossroads, a fork in the road. I felt like I had to make a radical shift if I didn't want my life to look like this, in and out of hospital, manic episode, manic episode, manic episode. And so I made 2 really important realizations that still kind of dictate my life. And the first one was acceptance of my condition. So up until that point, I was saying that I was just an addict, alcoholic, which I also am, but I was saying that that was my only issue and that I didn't have bipolar. And I felt like specifically that, at least in the climate of Los Angeles, was more socially acceptable, much more socially acceptable than having bipolar. So I lied and lied and I lied so much that I really myself didn't think I had bipolar. I just thought, well, I've had 3 manic episodes just because. But that had to end. That kind of rhetoric and thought patterns had to end, because I realized I could not get better if I didn't accept what I was dealing with and accept, my diagnosis, bipolar disorder. And my second realization was that I had to totally commit to recovery. I had to put everything I had and more into getting better and, in a sense, to beating this. Of course, as I said, it's not curable yet, but it is something, and this was told to me many times until I believed it, it is something, and every mental health condition is to a certain extent, it is something that you can live with, that you can lead a full life with. So I realized that I had to, really just commit 100% to the process of recovery. And this started with something called inpatient treatment. So whereas outpatient treatment, I was living at home and going to this office every day, inpatient treatment, I was living with a group of guys again, dealing with similar issues as me, and going to various groups and such during the day. And this was really hard. This is not how I imagined my first time living away from home to be. I think most people think it's college or just getting their own apartment. That was not my situation. It was, living in this house with a bunch of other people struggling with mental health. And I had a hard time at first. I had a hard time being away from home in this situation. My parents couldn't really come visit me. I didn't have my phone, which was, obviously horrible at the time. But it proved to really help, and it proved to be the turning point of my recovery, because this was in September of 2018. And in the almost 5 years since that time, since when I entered inpatient treatment, I have not had a single manic episode. I'm so happy, elated to sit here and say that. And I consider myself very lucky, to be honest, to have received these kind of treatment opportunities, which not many people get, which the people in that original psych ward who were scaring me and freaking me out, I don't think they really got these treatment opportunities that I ended up receiving. Of course, I had to take advantage of them, but the opportunities were presented to me, and for that, I am eternally grateful. And they were presented to me by my family, and I am so grateful for my family, my extended family, and especially my dad. And I know I'm not just saying this because he's on this call. I really mean it. My dad has been there for me every day, every second of this journey, sometimes too much, but he's there for me when I need him, and he's there for me when I don't, and he answers every call. Okay, that's not quite the handoff. So I still use things.
Can I just jump in and say thank you? And I feel the same way. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay, me too.
Absolutely. Thanks.
I think we can go to the next slide now, right? Marquis?
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
I could have done that. So yeah, I still use things that I learned in treatment to this day. The importance of a daily routine, eating right and exercising regularly, perhaps most importantly, reaching out to family and friends when I feel down, which can still be hard when I'm feeling sad or mad, sort of gaining the courage to pick up the phone or to go see somebody. But I know that when I do, I always feel better every single time. Everyone has their own experiences with medication, and I shared I had a pretty tough experience around the time of my graduation, but ultimately I have been greatly helped by working closely with a psychiatrist and developing a medication plan. And my relationship with a psychiatrist sort of is an example of developing a partnership with a medical professional. And another one of these partnerships I have had is with a therapist who I meet with once a week, who I've met with once a week, throughout this entire process and journey of recovery. And it's important when you seek out a therapist or really any medical professional to help with your mental health to find someone that you trust and you feel you can confide in. And so I'm very happy and grateful I've found someone like that, that I can tell everything, I can get it all out. And individual therapy has really worked for me, but there are many forms of therapy that work for different people.
Right. So, yes, thank you, Bud. And I mean, you just covered so much. And again, I hope some of that, at least some landed, because this is a guy who is dealing with feeling lost, confused, and keeps showing up. And he accepted finally some help from me and his mom, but that, we can't do it all. And we knew we could do it all. So I'm so glad that he has, frankly, a team that he's cultivated partnerships with. And I also really want to say, especially since we're talking to family members and loved ones, the importance of forming partnerships with your school. I mean, we work very closely with Ryder's High School to help him, get his high school diploma, frankly. I mean, his manic episode, the first one, hit with 3 months before he graduated. And so we really had to learn how to work with the school, work with the counselor, get him the support he needed to finish school. And then by the time he went to college, which was now, a year and a half later, because he took that gap year off, he knew that he had to form partnerships with the mental health services at his school. So again, we were able to support that, but really we were supporting him understanding how to form these partnerships himself. Now, for me, individual therapy has been really helpful. It's been 49 years since we lost our mom, and it took me until a year and a half ago to get into trauma-specific therapy. And the particular kind of therapy I practice now is called brain spotting. I'm happy to share more about it, but it's been very helpful, sort of targeting the areas in the brain that experience the trauma and sort of activating the brain's ability to heal itself. So that's all part of outside help, how we turn to others, whether it's schools, professionals, support groups. NAMI, let me not forget NAMI. Again, those first NAMI support groups and the NAMI classes were, and I'm happy to be a shill for NAMI. They literally were life-saving and life-changing, especially since it led me to one of the greatest jobs I've ever had, working at NAMI West Side. So again, what's happening is we're learning to ask for help, and we're learning that there is no shame in asking for help. And we're also learning how to receive help, because it's one thing to be able to ask for it, but then you have to let people give it to you. You have to let them love you, let them work the magic they have to support you, whether it's a therapist or a family member, a loved one, or a support group. Support groups have been very helpful for me. I'm really big fan of the 12 steps, and big fan of developing what we called at NAMI positive coping strategies. And that for me is playing music with friends, exercise, being outdoors, and frankly, talking honestly is a positive coping strategy for me now. Now, one last thing I will say, and I'm really sorry, I really love the opportunity to have a webinar, and we do have a communication technique that we want to share about. But what would be really great is to be in person there and to hear from the audience. What are you guys doing? What are you, family members, loved ones, doing? Not just to help your loved one. What are you doing to help yourself? What are your positive coping strategies? So I hope you'll think a little bit about that as we wind down this presentation. A big one for me and Ryder, a mutual positive coping strategy has been playing pickleball. And yeah, we're part of the pickleball crowd. I hope that doesn't turn off some of our audience immediately, but it has been really a fun thing for us to do. And it has brought up some conflict, which we want to share about and share sort of, we want to let you all in on a little communication technique we've developed. And Marquise, you can go to the last slide. And we call it calm communication. And, one of the issues we were thinking last night, what should we talk about? Well, frankly, pickleball gives us a pretty good opportunity here to talk about how we work through a really difficult conflict around pickleball. You want to get us started there, bud?
Yeah, so we've gotten really into the game the last year or so, and we play a lot. We've honestly been playing like twice a week together at least for several months. But one issue that we've really run into is my dad giving me tips during games. Stand here, hold your paddle like this. Don't do this, don't do that, la la la. And I know it sounds really enlightening, but it was really annoying me. It was really angering me. And a couple weeks ago on ride home from playing, I lost it. And I said, you know what, Dad, I don't want to play with you anymore. Of course, I didn't mean it because I love playing, but I was very mad and I felt like maybe that would get his attention. And I think I realized pretty quickly that he didn't understand what he was doing wrong. And so we ended up using our little technique here, which starts with C, connect. And so we connected with each other. We brought down the temperature.
And what that looked like, bud, is it wasn't like just flipping a switch. I mean, you were furious. And you say now that you're kidding. You seemed very serious about not playing anymore. That's how I experienced it, and that was a wake up call for me. So how I remember it is, we kind of both took a deep breath, and like, we knew we didn't want to give this up, but like, we had come up against this really thorny issue. And the fact is, I love coaching. I love teaching new players. I love playing with my son. I love giving him tips. I want him to be better, right? What's wrong with that? Well, he's not receiving the tips the way I want him to. He's receiving the tips like daggers. And so what we had to do is first just like connect. And that's what we do, is we connect with curiosity. What is up with you? How are you experiencing this? And what that does is, like he was saying, is it brings the temperature down and allows us to start accepting something about the other that we haven't been able to see or haven't allowed ourselves to see. And in this case, yeah, I had to accept that my well-intended tips were just hurting it every time I gave them. So despite my best intentions, those tips weren't having the effect I wanted. That was what I accepted about Ryder.
And I was able to accept that my dad was coming from a place of love and support, even though I perceived him coming from a place of, talking down to me and, oh, I know how to play and you don't. And so I had to kind of shift my perspective on where he was coming from. And the next step, as you can see, was to learn. So once I had accepted how he felt, I really had to examine what I could myself do differently so that this doesn't happen in the future. And for me, I learned that I don't have to take, and this is a lifelong process, I don't have to take what my dad says quite so personally. And when I'm upset, if I want to reach him, I should communicate more clearly and calmly. No pun intended.
Yeah, well, and the lesson for me is no more tips. No tips unless he asks for it. And actually, that extends to all areas of our relationship. So and again, I don't do this perfectly, but I try to ask him first if I want to give him some feedback or if I want to give him a tip. Although I've learned no tips on the court, but maybe after the game, I'll want to say a couple things, and I'll say, hey, would you like to hear? And sometimes he'll say, sure. And a lot of times he said, no, Dad, I'm good. So that's really good to really, again, we accept something about the other person, and then we learn what we can do differently. And then the most important thing here is the M, which I'll let him share about. But we are both big talkers, and I in particular can be an over processor. So this next one is really important.
So now comes the most important step, which is to move on. And yes, my dad and I love to talk, and sometimes we reach a conclusion on a dispute or argument, but then we just keep talking and then we argue again. And particularly, I know my sister is a real chief witness, and we don't want to subject her to this anymore. I think
she's actually been I think she's a big part of how we got to the M in this process, because yeah, she's like, that's enough. I mean, she's sat in the back seat for a lot of these fights, and she's been really helpful in sort of putting up some guardrails. So, and I kind of think of this M particularly as developing a spiritual muscle of patience, tolerance, and shutting up. That's actually a muscle that I've had to learn to develop. So we'll be happy to talk more about this at the Q&A, and I know we're right up against it. So Ryder, do you want to just quickly take us through the takeaways, or should we just leave the takeaways up while we go to the Q&A?
We don't have to talk about them. Yeah, sure.
How does that sound, Marquise? If there are questions, we'd love to have some time to answer.
I think they speak for themselves. Yeah.
I think they do too.
And thank you so much for sharing your story. There's a lot in the chat of just affirming that this has been really helpful, and thank you for sharing. And it is now time for us to transition to our question and answer. For those of you that are watching, remember that you all will stay muted to avoid background noise, but you can type your question into the question box at the right-hand side of the screen if viewing from a computer, or at the bottom of the screen if viewing from a phone. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, or if you have a comment about the webinar today, please enter these into the questions box now. If we do not have time to answer each question today, we will provide our contact information at the end of the webinar for anyone who may wish to reach us. And we do have some pre-submitted questions we can start with. Our first question is, how do you communicate with a loved one who has a mental health condition but is extremely paranoid and defensive?
But can I start on this one? As I remember seeing this, and this is, first of all, I don't think Ryder's particular symptoms have led him to too much paranoia, but I know that we both can get very defensive about our positions. And one thing I've had to learn is, and again, he put it beautifully about not taking what I say personally. You've got to learn, we've got to learn not to always take things personally, even when you're being attacked by someone. And what I can kind of see, and Ryder, you let me know how this feels, but like a lot of times if he's coming at me and I'm in sort of a good, calmer, evolved state, I can see it as maybe an expression of his discomfort, maybe an expression of his condition. So it's not necessarily him saying this, but it's something that I want to process and not over process, but I want to hear from him, but not take it personally. Because when you take it personally, you just also, the natural impulse is to defend and explain, and defending and explaining rarely works in my experience. What does work is connecting and saying, God, I know you're angry, and boy, do I know what it's like to have a father who says something that's well intended, but actually feels like he's hurting, or it's a criticism or a judgment. That feels terrible. So I'm showing Ryder that I know what that feels like. And also when I've shared with Ryder about my mom, it sort of levels the playing field. He remembers, and it's not like, oh, woe is me, but it's like, yeah, I've dealt with this too. And we're together, we can support each other. So really trying to form that teamwork, and really coming back to calm, connect, accept, learn, and then move on. So we're not, belaboring it. Anything, but you wanted to add to that? Or counter? You have a counterpoint?
No. In this question, I'm the loved one, so I don't have much to offer.
Well, but hold on, you've had to deal with plenty of defensiveness.
Let's get to the next question.
All right, next question.
Okay, so a next question is, how can severe adverse childhood experiences predict possible outcomes for schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorders? It's up to you if you feel like you can answer.
This was one, again, remember we said we're not experts, we're experts in our own lived experience. This unfortunately is outside our lived experience. So ACEs is something I've become very aware of, that's adverse childhood experiences. And I know that ACEs can impact all of us, whether you end up having a diagnosed condition or not. So it's really, I hope that one thing, if nothing else comes through today, is like learning to share about this and ask for help with your own trauma is always going to be helpful. But we haven't dealt with schizoaffective disorder or those kinds of symptoms, so probably can't speak to that.
And
I see, yeah.
There's a submitted question. At any point was there, and actually Ryder touched on this a little, but someone was curious about, the overuse or over-reliance of substances as a part of your journey, and if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. I saw a number of psychiatrists during that first stretch, and so I wouldn't say that. And I think this question is about prescription medication, right?
No,
It
not
didn't
necessarily.
specify. Just like if there was an over-reliance or
Okay.
overuse.
Well, yeah. I guess I was going to answer it. Each psychiatrist I saw had kind of a different approach, some with more meds, some with less. And that stretch of my life where I was really struggling, and I was on a lot of antipsychotics to bring me down, that was the most sort of adverse. I was very angry at having to take these meds, and the meds I'm on, the meds I'm on now, I'm very comfortable. I don't enjoy taking, but I embrace taking, because they've really helped. So I think it can be hard for anyone who is prescribed psychiatric meds of any kind to accept them if they're not getting any kind of result. But I would stress patience, because right now, today, I feel the best I've felt since my diagnosis, but it's been a while. It's been 5.5 years. So it is not a magic. I wished and prayed that there was some pill that came out and I would go back to the way I was before. But just quickly to answer the other end of that, and I mean, my dad maybe touched on this, but even before my diagnosis, where I didn't think anything was wrong with me or I didn't think I had any mental health conditions, I was self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. So I think that's very common, maybe now more than ever, with young people and teens. So
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate the point. Thank you, buddy. And what I also want to reiterate is how important it is to see those troubles not as bad behavior, but as symptomatic of difficult feelings that aren't being handled well. So, and then, again, when 40 years ago, when I was having trouble with drugs and alcohol, I was suspended from school. I was a bad kid. I was a problem child. That's what the messaging that I was receiving, rather than, oh, Tim needs some support here. And now I'm not looking for anyone else. I say that to myself. I need some support. And I'm really proud of how Ryder, again, has supported himself through this journey, and how we both have learned to live with having addictive personalities, but not letting those personalities run the show, but understanding them and sort of forming a better relationship, frankly, with yourself. Can we run over? I just want to know, I mean, do we have any leeway, or do we have to stop right at 1? Because we love answering these questions, but I do see we're up against it.
Yeah, it's fine. We could go a couple minutes over.
Okay, great.
All right.
So there are a couple questions. Someone's asking, is there an antipsychotic that you think works best? Or I don't know if you want to share what medication you're on currently. I know everyone's different though, but if you don't mind sharing what is working for you right now.
that's a great question. Quickly, and I know we don't have much time, but this is a NAMI presentation. When I first trained to be a NAMI presenter years ago, I started listing off, like this is like the very first training. I was listing off what I took, and my dad was one of the trainers. The other trainer said, you can't do that. But in this context, I'll tell you, I'm no longer on antipsychotics. I haven't been for a couple of years once I stopped having those episodes. But I was on one particular that I'll tell you, Seroquel, which caused me to gain about 50 pounds in a couple months. I was eating 24/7, but looking back, I think it did kind of stop the mania, and like really, like a drain plug or whatever. And so now, in terms of addressing my bipolar, I take lithium. That's sort of my like baseline. And I used to take, so that's a mood stabilizer. And there's only really one other main mood stabilizer called Depakote. And I think both of those work for different people. Depakote did not work for me, but lithium I've been on for now most of this time, 5 years. And it's really worked.
And we're very blessed that.
Did we lose him?
Yeah, Tim, right now you're a little frozen right now, but maybe it'll come back in a minute.
I think he's saying something wise, so I feel bad, but
okay. But we can ask one more question.
Yeah.
Ryder, this one is actually addressed to you. So the person says, Ryder, my son has schizophrenia and he is very isolated, which makes me anxious, but I wait for him to come out and speak to me. And they're trying to be patient, and they're trying to be helpful.
What the?
And is it helpful? Oh, and is it helpful for them, because they're trying not to be they're trying to give space and they're trying to be supportive. I don't know if there's any advice for them. Just they don't want to be too overbearing. They want to give them space. And they also thank you for your thoughts.
I really appreciate that question. I think we can both take a hack at it. This is a good final question. So I think there was definitely a time, I didn't have schizophrenia, but there was a time in my process and journey where I really didn't want to talk to my parents. They were the last people on earth I wanted to talk to. And in more general terms about isolation, I know that when I isolate, I will feel worse. I don't know if that's everyone's experience, but for me personally, when I, get in my room and just shut in and don't leave, it sort of really harms my mental health. So I think he can speak to the parent part as well, but I think it's really hard to be patient, and I assume you want to see your son like re-enter the world and at the very least re-engage with you. But I think continuing to be patient, but also that's where he's at right now. And so if you push on that, I think I'm no doctor, but if you push back on that, it will make things harder. So accepting, we preach a lot about acceptance. So accepting where he's at in that isolation might go a long way to eventually, getting him out and getting him to communicate.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I'm sorry, I guess my computer just froze. So I'm glad I was able to run up here and join the big guy here. What I would say about that is, yeah, it's the most difficult thing to see a child suffer and to not know how to help and to not know it, and they're not receiving what you want, the way you want to support them. Well, you let them know that you're available, and then you get help for yourself. And that, again, that's where the NAMI support groups came in, because I heard people reinforcing that message, like, you can't force somebody to get help, especially an adult child. There has to be some openness, some willingness for them to help themselves. So just to let them know that you're still there, you're available, and you kind of lead by example. You're getting help for yourself. And I think Ryder has seen that in both me and his mom. We've taken care of ourselves. And, it's the old oxygen mask metaphor. If we're not, we can't show up for him. And I think it has made it us more available when he was ready to reconnect and share a little bit more about where he's at, and then start to slowly but surely accept our help.
Great question.
Yeah, thank you for that. By the way, if people want to submit some answers, we can also submit some questions. We're happy to stay in touch through email. But again, Gia, thank you.
Yeah,
really,
thank you everybody for having us.
So
really
appreciate this.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad we get to end in the same box. And I know he's so annoyed, but
I guess this was always going to happen.
It was always going to happen.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us. Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thank you again to Tim and Ryder and Gia for volunteering your time this afternoon for this exceedingly useful discussion. As a reminder, the webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded to our website at www.namimd.org for any individuals who were unable to register for the webinar today. We hope that this webinar has been helpful for you this afternoon. At the end of the webinar today, you'll be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved, and what you would like to see in future webinars. We plan to continue hosting educational webinars, and this survey will help determine how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. We wish you all a safe and healthy rest of your week, and please do not hesitate to reach out to us through our website or by phone at 410-884-8691 should you need additional resources or support. Have a great rest of your day.
Damn.
I would see it.
Can you still hear us?
Yeah, we're about to close it up. You want to say something else?
Yeah,
No,
just wanted to say
guys.
thank you so much. This really was.
I hope, I hope there was some good stuff in there.
No problem. Yep. And I'm going to support you to any unanswered questions that we have.
Sure.
Yes.